Don't show me tears don't rain, and I'll take the old songs. We don't think white men feel reggae. 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 White men feel reggae.
Hey everybody, it's your old friend Cherry. Glorious late winter sun. You might hear Sam in the background. Sam the cat's complaining. He's in his cat house. He wants to be with me. He's in love with me. And he wouldn't be the first guy. But today I'm going to fill you in a little, and it's probably going to take a couple of episodes to go back to the 1980s. So we're going to leave the Boer War monuments alone for the moment, but we'll get back to them. And this is a stream we've called The Trip, which involved my family going to Africa in 1971, me returning in 1976. But I couldn't leave it alone. There's something about Africa, if it gets into you. I mean, my dad had no intention of ever returning from Africa when he found paradise there. I mean, he said there was something about the cradle of humanity. Maybe that was it, the smell of the rain on the parched soil, and the crack of the thunder, and the animals, the elephants and the giraffe and the thorn trees. Just something about Africa, the smell of it, the colour of the dirt, the red soil, and of course those smiling, happy Africans generally that are there, that are such lovely people with their music and their dancing and their simple way of life and their culture. So Dad never wanted to come back, and I had a love-hate relationship with it. I hated it when I was in Brakpan because it seemed so backwards. I wanted long hair and jeans and rock music, and it was so conservative and seemingly backwards. So I hated it when I was there. But when I left, as I said, I couldn't leave it alone. So I'm not going to go into everything that happened to me after I got back. Suffice to say that I was living with my sister and her husband Roscoe, and Roscoe sometimes would get a phone call at night and he'd say, I have to go into work, and sometimes I'd go in with him. Now, he was a computer systems analyst, systems programmer, something like that. He'd done his training at Carlton United Brewery. Him and a whole lot of other guys in the early 70s. They all had long bushy hair, bushy moustaches, body shirts, and they were a sort of an elite clique of guys in the real early days of IT. Now, when we get into, we go to a place called Ajax Fasteners, and there was a big room, like a warehouse, with all air conditioned and rows of these tape machines with tape spinning around and then dropping, and that wasn't really new, because in some of those 1950s and 60s movies Brian and I like, the old sci-fis, you sometimes see primitive computer rooms and they've got tape machines that are reading. That's kind of what Ajax had, and they also had these big square disk drives with platters. You'd lift out this big platter. It'd be the circumference of a pizza box and deep, with all these platters. That's where that's where it wrote its memory. And so I said, it looks a bit like a laundromat, and that seemed to stick with them. They thought that was funny. I described the computer room as a laundromat. So little did I know. I mean, I had no idea at school ever what I wanted to do as far as a working career. So I had, after I finished school in 78, I did year 12, I got like a complimentary pass. They were feeling generous. And I think I applied for a couple of jobs out of the paper, but yeah, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And so Roscoe said to me that they're advertising for jobs, or there's positions at work if you want to apply. Now, I knew most of those guys Roscoe worked with because they would come over for dinners. There was long, boozy dinners with my sister and Roscoe, red wine and bawdy jokes and cigars and all sorts of stuff going on. You know, we're talking about, yeah, 78. So I knew most of them socially. So I went in for the interview, and you know, they must have probably got a bit of priority because they were familiar with me. So I got a job as a computer operator in 78. And it was sort of training on the spot. It wasn't all that involved. You basically looked at, there was a flickering, it was a mainframe, it was a Honeywell level 64, I think it was, which was a mainframe. It had ducted air coming through the floor and from the ceiling. It had to be you know, a controlled temperature in there. And the main console would have a flickering light. If it was green, it was happy, the computer was doing its work. If it stopped, it would go to a red stop, and you'd have to go from the computer, you know, where we used to relax. We had couches, we had big lounge chairs, and we'd get up, we'd go into the computer room and see what it was. Now, there was like a console with paper that used to record our, you know, interaction with the computer, and normally if it had stopped, it wanted a tape mounted, or it wanted, or the job had finished, or all that sort of stuff. So it was pretty easy. Now, I'm going to give you an example of what was going on, which my mate over there in South Africa still laughed about. This is what happened to me. I wasn't there very long. I was there about a month or 2 months. The night shift, I was on my own, mind you. So there were 3 of us computer operators working 3 shifts. So if you're on the night shift, you got in about 10, and you worked from you know, 11 to 7 or something like that. But if you finished early, you could go a bit earlier if you got all the work out of the way. So the night shift, there wasn't a lot of work going on. The computer sort of ran itself. And, you know, I could be particularly lazy with example giving, because some of the other operators used to bring in their TVs and watch TV at night. So I was inventing games on my own. But one night in there was like a fire button. It had a round glass, you know, with a little hammer. Smash here in case of fire, it said. Now my mind started thinking, I wonder if there's a black seal behind that ring, which is like I'm wearing now, which is a leftover from South Africa. I don't know. Look, I wasn't the most intelligent 18 or 19-year-old, and I've been given no training in case the fire alarm ever went off. So I started unscrewing this thing, and I'm talking about 2 or 3 in the morning, and the next minute, and it was flashing. All the alarms went off. It started flashing, evacuate, evacuate. Now, in that area where we were sitting as the computer operators were all these shelves with all the paper files. In those days, everything was paper. And I managed to get on the phone to my supervisor, a Scotsman called George, to ask him what to do. And, you know, I woke him up, and he just blurted out the words, "Get out of there, the halon's going to go off." And the next minute, bang! And all this gas came up through the floor. This was to extinguish any flames. And it blew all the folders off all those shelves. They were just fluttering down. I heard George yelling through the receiver, which I dropped, "Get to the front door, the fire brigade will be there." So I rushed out, and sure enough, in this little street, dead-end street, in the middle of the night, were these fire trucks with, you know, red and blue, and guys with axes and, you know, helmets. "Where's the fire? Where's the fire?" I said, no, that was just a, you know, false alarm. So they came and checked it all out. Of course, I had to explain this. I mean, and it cost Ajax thousands. Ajax made nuts and bolts, by the way. Huge factory, stretching from Burnley Street, Richmond, right down to the Yarra River. Huge hangar-sized factory where they made, where they melted steel to make nuts and bolts. But anyway, yeah, I had to explain it to the boss and the manager the next day. Well, one of the other guys I worked with, Derek, he used to heat up muffins and that on. We had an open bar heater. He used to cook muffins on this heater, and it wasn't unknown for them. There was another computer operator who used to take his motorbike apart in a relaxation area, and he'd smoke a pipe. So occasionally the fire alarm would go off, but they knew how to disable it if it did, but I'd never been shown. So I came up with some story that I was cooking toast on the heater, gone in to change some tapes, and it set it off. So that's one incident that I never can forget. And yeah, how stupid can you be? But anyway, the point being that after a few years, I thought I was some sort of hotshot computer operator that was fully trained and had opportunities around the world. I mean, I should have got into computer programming, and it was kind of mentioned, but I just wasn't really suited to thinking type stuff. I was more suited to playing cricket on my own in the hallway in the middle of the night while the computer was doing its thing, or reading comic books in the lounge chair while the computer was doing the work. So I started to get a bit bored and a bit restless. And in about, I'm going to say 1982, I'd been going out with a girl for, since the time of working in the supermarket. My first sort of serious girlfriend after Rusty, Jenny back in Brackpan. And she was a lovely girl. But, I was restless, and I was a budding young alcoholic, drug addict. So hard to keep me kind of content. So I started thinking about going back to Africa, and I had a friend called Tom at the time. He was a mechanic, motor mechanic, and I'd met him through my mate Steve. Steve broke his leg on a motorbike. We went in to visit Steve in the hospital, and Steve said, "Oh, this is Tom." He was in the bed next to Steve with a broken leg. They both had pins put in their leg from coming off motorbikes. So I befriended this guy, Tom. He lived out in Mitcham. His father was a doctor, his mother was an anaesthetist. They had money, but they lived in an old sort of weatherboard cottage out there in Mitcham where, it was a dirt road where he lived. So anyway, I started talking to him about travelling, and he seemed keen. So, I thought, oh, well, I'll go back to South Africa and I'll work for, a year or so on the mines. I'll make lots of money. I'm a computer operator. I can work anywhere. I'm in demand. So Tom and I decided to head over to Africa. And I said, it would have been, I reckon, January or February 82. Only thing I can line it up with is that Karen Carpenter died as we got to Johannesburg. I had this suitcase with, the wheels on the bottom, but they were real sort of primitive back then. And we carried so much luggage, like it was, you're allowed 20 kilo. My sister had to talk to the baggage handlers. I had a squash racket, I had big books to show my friends, I had all my photos, because to my mind we were going indefinitely. So yeah, my buddy suitcase, the wheel blew off as we were leaving the airport and trying to get a hotel in Johannesburg, and Tom seemed far more organised, and I was thinking, because he's never travelled, he'll struggle, and I'm a seasoned traveller, I know Africa, I'll be fine. Well, actually it was the opposite. I had a series of things go wrong, all my own fault, all my own stupidity, and so the first thing we did, we stayed in a hotel in in Johannesburg for a couple of days while we acclimatised, and we had, in those days you travel with checks, travel checks from Thomas Cook. So we were going up to see Dad, and we had put some things in the airport locker when we arrived, because I realised how bloody heavy my bag was. So I put some things in the aircraft locker, and we were going to fly up to see Dad. Now, we got there late to the airport. It was Jan Smuts Airport in those days. We were actually called over the speaker over the overhead speakers and saying, you know, could you please report to the checkout, the plane is ready to leave. They wouldn't do that these days, you wouldn't think. So we're running along, things are falling out of my bag, running to get the plane to fly to Victoria Falls. It's a small plane, probably Air Zimbabwe. Now, Zimbabwe had only been independent for 2 years, and they actually, one of the hosties came up and spoke to Tom and I and said, would you like to come up and see the pilot? Once again, that doesn't happen now, but we were approaching the Victoria Falls from the air, and well, wow, it was a magnificent view. You could see the mist from the falls rising up over the African bush from a distance, and the pilot, you know, quite chatty and all that. So we arrived, young bucks, you know, full of enthusiasm, girls and beer and good time. Dad picked us up and we went down to stay with him. He lived about an hour south of Victoria Falls in a little town called Wankie, which was a coal mining town with big funnels in the distance billowing out whatever they were. It was a smelter for the coal, and they were producing power for the country. Huge. Dad worked in the bakery in this little town of Wankie. Well, we just arrived and he said to us, oh, there's a cricket game on today and they're expecting you to play. So we went along to this charming little cricket ground in Wankie with a little koppies, as we hear in the Boer War videos, koppies around with baboons up there and bush around, and you know, there were all these whites, predominantly whites, still Africans, bringing out your beers and serving behind the bar and, you know, clearing up the glasses and that. And they were all Rhodesians mostly, but there were a lot of international people there to build the power station. There were Indians, Pakistanis, Irish, Scots. Yeah, and we had to open the batting for, you know, Tom knew nothing about cricket. He put the pad on the wrong leg, as I recall. I took it a lot more seriously than I needed to. It was just a lot of fun. And at the end of the game, both teams would sit on the Wankie Oval, and the Africans would bring out 2 crates of beer, and both teams would sit and drink all the beer before heading back into the pavilion. So within days, I used to go up to Dad's bakery and met all his workmates. His boss was a really nice fella, and we were invited to barbecues, or briflaces they were called. We were invited out to the game park. We played squash in the number 1 club. The number 1 club was where they all drank, where Dad drank. A beautiful swimming pool, all that stuff. So we were there for a couple of weeks, I'd say, and I fell in love with the place. I didn't want to leave. I loved it so much that I didn't want to leave. But of course I was a computer operator, whereas Tom, they actually approached him because they needed motor mechanics, and they would have organised for him to stay there and work if he'd wanted. But he said, no, it's just started. The adventure has just started. I want to go down to Cape Town. So anyway, we got the train from Bulawayo. Dad drove us down to Bulawayo. We stayed with his friend, oh God, I don't know the name, Ray and Becky. Ray was a single white man from Manchester or something like that. He was like a construction site manager, and Becky was his African girlfriend, and they'd fight like cat and dog. And one time Becky had thrown a ashtray and hit Ray in the eye, and he had a lazy eye. But they were hell of a nice people. And so Dad, you know, wished us well, gave us a bit of money. We got on the train at Bulawayo, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we got drunk. We were horribly, horribly drunk. Ended up making idiots of ourselves. We were thrown off the train at Mafeking. Interesting, eh? And we had to sit on Mafeking station in the blazing African sun for hours. The South African passport control, you know, Afrikaners in white safari suits, took our passports and said, we're going to see whether you'll be allowed entry or not. Because we made such clowns of ourselves on the train. And anyway, yeah, eventually they came back and they kept us sitting in the sun all day with this blazing headache, hangover. It was horrible. And they gave us the passport back so we could get the next night train back into Johannesburg. And then it was hanging around Joburg while, we decided what we're going to do. So Tom got a job real quick. He worked for BMW in Johannesburg, and I remember him saying to me, I would never have got a job this prestigious in Melbourne. And he bought himself a real big motorbike. It was an era where on the pavements of Joburg, these white men would have these huge 1100, latest motorbikes, and they rode like there was no tomorrow. They had no fear, no helmets, just racing around on these huge machines. So Tom got himself a big motorbike. This is where things started to, I call it bad luck, but really it was, some of it was luck. Most of it was my stupidity and alcoholism. First thing that happened was I went to use the public phone at the post office, and had these shorts on that didn't have pockets, like sports shorts. I had a wallet in my hand. I put the wallet next to my hand while I was ringing the number, and there was a tap on the glass on the other side of the phone booth with an African saying, have you got any change? And I'm saying, no, I don't have any change. And that was the time when man B had come behind me and slipped his arm through and grabbed the wallet. So now I'm finding that my wallet's gone. In those days you didn't really have credit cards and all that. It wasn't such a big deal, I suppose, but there were a few names in there and a bit of cash, and it was sentimental, the wallet, so that went. The next thing that happened was I was out with old Johan van Rensburg, my mate from Brakpan High. We'd been out. I'd been away, I think, because I had my backpack with me. I'm not sure why I had. We booked into a hotel called the Allendine, Tom and I, in Hillbrow, which was the sort of bohemian section of Joburg. And for some reason I'd gone there, and Tom was away from the hotel room and he'd taken the key, so I couldn't put my backpack in the room. So I met up with Johan and we put it in the boot of his car, and we went out drinking. And after a few hours we came back and the car was gone, and now that really did my head in. There was all my photos were in there, my traveller's checks, my references from work. It was just ridiculous. Of course I had to ring my sister, and she had to try and get copies of things, and it was just a load of bullshit. And I was heartbroken and I was devastated. I hitchhiked over to Botswana maybe to see if I could get any work there. I hated Johannesburg, so I hitchhiked over to Botswana. Of course, I didn't know where to approach or what to do. So anyway, I got back to Joburg and stayed at the Allendine Hotel again, which was full of bums and people down on their luck. And anyway, reading the local paper, and I put in ads and all that about retrieving the photos and that from the backpack, but of course that car would have gone into Soweto and been disintegrated and never to be seen again. I was reading the paper and I noticed there was an ad for a place or a mine called Rossing in Namibia, or Southwest Africa as it was then, and it mentioned they had a Honeywell computer. So I don't know whether I wrote to them or rang the number, and I told them that I had work experience on a Honeywell in Melbourne. I'd got copies of my references sent over to me from my sister. I think I had to get a new passport. But my sister, of course, came to the rescue as always when anything went wrong. I looked at her to fix my problems. Anyway, they called me for an interview in Johannesburg with this Rossing uranium, and it turned out that they were looking for a computer operator over there, and the Honeywell business that I was talking about was actually their air conditioning. But they didn't care too much. They said, we'll offer you a position. So I got offered this job over there in a place called Swakopmund, which was a German, it had a German name because it was a German colony for a while.